Welcome to the Inventory Professional Podcast, brought to you by InventoryBase, providers of industry-leading property inspection software, accredited training, and on-demand property reports. Join us as we discuss the latest news, legislation, and all things property, hosted by our very own inventory expert, Sean Hemming-Metcalf. With regular special guests, listen in to our open and honest discussions about the role of the inventory professional and how to navigate through this ever-changing, fast-paced industry.
So welcome to the InventoryBase Academy podcast with myself, Sean from InventoryBase, and the lovely Melissa from MGN Inventories. Melissa, it's been a while.
I know, it's been surprising actually. I suppose it's with the summertime, but you lose track of how quickly time goes, and then all of a sudden it got cold and I thought, oh, it has been a while.
Oh yeah, it has, isn't it? I mean, obviously I've been noticing that the mornings getting darker, evenings getting a bit darker, etc. But I think the last couple of days have really brought home to the fact that we're now in autumn, and that we're getting into the cold season, which I never like, because often I find some houses are much colder inside than they are outside, which completely sounds daft, but they are, and I'm not looking forward to that side of things. But in a way, it's nice to be heading towards Christmas, and I hope we can enjoy Christmas, bearing in mind everything that's going on. But like you said, these last 6 months, it's weird that we're even talking about the fact that we've been in some kind of restriction, stroke lockdown, stroke weird situation for the last 6 months, because it's flown by in some respects really, really quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I was having this conversation with someone the other day, and I said I really do feel like I did sort of January, February, March, and then it's just been a blur, and then all of a sudden we're in September. It does feel like the year's completely gone, and I don't know, in my mind I kind of think, oh, we'll just get this year over and then everything will be back to normal, but really we're nowhere near knowing that at all. But in my mind I do just keep thinking, oh yeah, we'll get to January and then things will just be the same they've always been. But there's a little bit of at this stage.
Yeah, it's kind of like you just want to put 2020 to bed, don't you? In a way, it's weird, because you would think 2020 is quite an interesting year just from the sound of it, and that it's going to be really buoyant and interesting and different. And I think it has been, but all for the wrong reasons. And
yeah, it's definitely been different.
yeah. So I'm in agreement with you. I'll be quite pleased when we get to New Year's Eve and that we can usher the new year in, and hopefully it'll be much more on a positive note. But to be fair, there's also been a lot of changes, a lot of updates within the industry. And I was kind of like, working my way through them earlier on just to kind of see what's been going on. I mean, and I've highlighted a few. One obviously being the fact that tenant fees, the transition period has now ended. That ended on 31st of May. So that is now fully embedded in law. And the fact that, tenants only have to provide the deposit plus a few other kind of pre-described requirements in regards to taking up a tenancy. So that's all changed. Although one thing, certainly from my point of view, and I don't know if you agree with this, is the fact that I haven't really seen much of a difference in regards to a slowdown in the market or a reduction in the amount of reports we've been doing, and also in regards to the fees that we ourselves as inventory providers charge.
No, so I haven't seen any downturn in it, and I did expect it. I kind of thought, well, if it's going to happen, it will be immediately when the fee, is fully in place. So landlords will say, oh no, I'll do the checkout myself. So I kind of expected it to happen this year, and then people learn from their mistakes and then start using people again for future tenancies. But I've not seen a downturn in it as much. I have seen a small impact from that, which I suppose is a side note to this, but I suppose it's important for inventory clerks and companies to be aware of. It's a few checkouts that I've done on chasing the agent for payment. They've said, oh, yes, I will chase the landlord for you, because they're now paying it directly. And that's something that we've never really, certainly myself, never really experienced before, because it's always come from the tenant's deposit, or they've taken it from the tenants before they've left the property. But that's something interesting to note now. And I think from a service provider's point of view, it doesn't matter to me if you say it's, the landlord's due to pay it. The agency, if it has been done through an agency, they're the ones that have booked it. So from my point of view, then it is actually them that I'll be chasing for payment. But that isn't something that I had anticipated. that now, because landlords have to pay for it themselves, that agents will actually say, oh yes, it's not us paying for it, even though we booked the job, it's someone else paying for it, and we'll chase them. So it's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, no, very much so. I mean, I personally haven't really experienced that. I work with a lot more corporate agents, and they tend to sort out that side of things very much up front in regards to the initial payment for the landlord. And certainly with our independents, and also when we talk to landlords, they tend to pay up front anyway. But that's an interesting point, and it'll be interesting to see what other providers are experiencing and whether that differs, whether that's better, that's worse. So it'd be interesting to see if we get any feedback on that. But that's a good point. I mean, the other kind of obvious changes has been, one, the lockdown, and then as we progressed and moved towards less restrictions, we then saw the market opening up. And I don't know about you, but we went from what I would say 0 to 100% rushing around like headless chickens once everybody was allowed to start to move, which is quite heartening, because obviously everyone was worried, and we had some clerks were self-isolating, but many were very worried about whether there was going to be any work anytime soon. But we haven't found that that's dropped off, and certainly in regards to the student season, that was just as busy, if not more busy, than it was this time last year. I don't know if you've experienced similar.
Yes, and I did. I think it all came at the same time, so it was kind of that busier time of year anyway, and then obviously the easing of restrictions. And I think everyone just been home for such a long time. Everyone was on Rightmove having a look, and I think the people that were sort of stuck in flats and things suddenly thought, oh, actually, I want to move and I want a garden. So it was that kind of impact of everyone all at once. People that were easing from lockdown thinking, yes, we'll move and we'll take this opportunity, and student season as well. And the agents that I spoke to said they were busier than they had ever been before. Not even sort of that time of year. It was literally the busiest that they'd been, trying to accommodate everyone with viewings and, getting move-ins happening.
Yeah, we had exactly the same. I mean, the viewing side, not so much from our point of view, because we don't, or I certainly don't deal in that side of the industry, but certainly talking to other people, that was extremely, extremely busy, and obviously very difficult because of having to wear masks, having to social distance, having to make sure that the property is well ventilated, making sure that anybody that was attending did so safely, and also for the viewer as well as the person actually conducting the actual viewings. They had to make sure that was all done. And obviously now we've got the introduction of masks as part of the new requirements under COVID for agents, mainly because they're now deemed as retails, because they've got a shop front, they're on the high street, as it were. So that's kind of changed things for us. We've now got our own entrance, as it were. Well, less of an entrance for some of our agents. One of them is actually just a very, very big window, but it's fine. We're quite happy because we're not traipsing through, we're not disturbing them. Our staff know to wear gloves and masks, etc. But I think that's definitely been a fundamental change, especially when they've brought in the new recent changes alongside the change for helping businesses and people through and past furlough, because that ends in October. I don't know if that's anything that's affected you at all on your side.
Not so much. It hasn't had too big of an impact, but now with everything else that's going on, because there isn't so much of an end in sight, it does make you think you can only plan so much, and yet so much of it is unknown, and it's almost just taking it day by day. A different thing announced and different procedures, and it's just trying to incorporate things as they happen, and see what you can do as you can do it, really.
Yeah, that's all you can do. I mean, a lot of this is very much play by ear. I mean, we've got the legislation, we've got the restrictions, we've got the guidance, so we kind of know what we should be doing. But a lot of it, the implementation of it, is very much a case of, well, making sure that you do it, see what the impacts are, and seeing how you can make them better for everybody, so that everybody can manage them. Because it's a difficult one right across the board. And certainly, I would argue from the tenant's point of view, and one of the things, the core discussion I wanted today is about tenants, about the fact that they're at home, and they're at home a lot more than they would do normally. And as someone pointed out on social media the other day, which got me really thinking, is about that fact that because they're at home, there's going to be a natural increase in fair wear and tear of the property, because they're going to be using the property so much more. I mean, to give an example, I'm a tenant at the moment. I actually had a visit from my landlord yesterday, totally pre-arranged, all good, everything's fine. And I was a bit concerned because we've got cream carpet, so I'm always kind of making sure they're kept clean, etc. But I also noticed they're a bit more worn than they would normally be, and that's because we're at home a lot more than we would normally be, so therefore we're using things, so their life expectancy, the fair wear and tear aspect, is really going to come into play, certainly at the end of my tenancy, and I would imagine the majority of tenants, especially if they are actually physically working from home. I don't know if that's something you're seeing, or anyone's mentioned, or you've thought about yourself.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a really good point that the wear and tear is increasing. I mean, on a couple of different notes, really. I mean, I did an inspection last week, and they had a baby in January, and it started crawling. So essentially, they've almost had the whole of lockdown in the house, and the mum had said, we've not had any baby groups to go to, and they've essentially just been in the house the entire time. And if you think normally, people with sort of newborn babies, young children, would be out the majority of the time, and I think the impact of having children in constantly, certainly all the ones that have been kept home from school for a period of months, that is a lot of extra wear to suddenly be seeing. And I think it's important that landlords are mindful of that, because I think some landlords are a bit predisposed to not want children anyway. It's my favourite thing. But then certainly if you've got a family, even if you've got 2 or 3 children and they've been home for months at a time, things are going to be more worn than what they would be. And it's unfair to necessarily put that on the tenant. Yes, it would have had a longer lifespan in a previous time, but not anymore.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, even just a general cleaning side of things, I seem to be cleaning a lot more than I would do normally, because normally during the core day you'd be out about doing things, etc. And certainly during the main lockdown, the initial lockdown period, I was at home a lot more. Like you said, you're using things more. You're creating a little bit more fair wear and tear. You are creating more dust. Having to clean more, and it was quite noticeable in some respects. I'm not saying I don't clean. I do. In fact, I probably clean more than some. But it was just that, because obviously what we do, and because of our eye for detail, you do kind of pick up on these things a lot more. And if you're using things day in, day out, opening doors, walking up and down carpets, up and down stairs, using the property as you should do, you're renting it, but it's still, your home, and you should be used appropriately, that you are going to see a definite increase. So I agree with you. I think it's something that landlords and agents need to be kind of more aware of, and expecting things may not be same as per normal, because there's going to be that extra wear going on. And another thing also I was thinking about is the fact that obviously this will increase the use of fuel bills, because again, we're home, especially now we're getting towards winter, we're turning the heating on, and maybe if you were out at work during the core day, you wouldn't have the heating on, you'd have it at night. But now if you're working at home, then the likelihood is you're going to heat the house, so fuel bills are going to be more. So meter readings, certainly at the end of the tenancy, are going to be more important than ever. I mean, I know a lot of meters are now smart meters, so a lot of the providers already know what the rates are, what to bill and who's responsible. But certainly I think as providers, we are going to need to ensure that we're capturing all that information, making sure that isn't missed. And I think another thing that is vital is interim visits, because there's going to be more need, I think, for maintenance, because again, we're using things, tenants are using items and things that they might have a potential to break down because they're being used more than they would normally be. The interim inspections are going to be quite important, more so than they ever have been before. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
So I think because we had that period where we weren't doing any interim inspections, it kind of doubles up with that as well. There are, from my point of view now, a backlog that needs to be done, and sort of landlords are quite keen to know how their property's been treated. And even when I was booking them the other day, I spoke to a tenant, and he said, what's the inspection about? And I described what would happen, and he said, oh, actually, I do have quite a few little maintenance bits. And I said, have you reported them to the agent or landlord? He said, oh no, I just, I didn't want to be a bother, but they're the kind of thing that do just build up. So and that, I think, depending on, how providers are doing it, whether you're booking them in or, it's going privately and you're being given a date and time, or an agent's booking it in, it's worthwhile trying to have that conversation with them. If they're not going to be home, certainly to leave you a note or to tell someone what their maintenance things are, because I think sometimes tenants feel like they don't want to be a bother, especially maybe in these times where they've been furloughed and there may or may not be an impact on their rent in that. I think people will be worried about seeming awkward to say, oh, I've got all this long list of things that need to be done. But they are silly things that mount up, like you saying, opening doors and things more. It might be a cupboard door and the hinge is loose, and some tenants, you'd expect them to screw that in, some haven't, whether that's now caused damage. Like you say, more than ever, it's going to be important to have accurate reports of what's happening. It's just really, I suppose, whether we're going to have further sanctions in place to do inspections. And I know you touched on something on one of our previous podcasts about tenants having the possibility of carrying out the inspection themselves through the software. And I think that might be something that we will be led into if it happens again, a further possible lockdown. We're already at a backlog now, so we're going to have to look at different ways of doing this to ensure that all of a sudden it's not 6 or 12 months and no inspections been carried out.
You're completely right there. I mean, I think you're perfectly right in regards to tenants do worry that they're going to be a problem, especially now, especially if they, as you said, that they've maybe organised a reduction in rent, or maybe they're not being able to pay rent for a little while, and maybe that's in agreement or not, as the case may be, with the landlord. And then to come up with a list of maintenance issues, then I can really see why people would be worried about that. But I think it's incumbent on agents, because obviously we're not going to see the tenant probably until the report's is been booked or at the end of the tenancy. So therefore we're not in a position to advise until we actually see them or talk to them. But I certainly think agents should be more aware of these issues and maybe doing more checks and maybe issuing more guidance and allaying those kind of fears that it's right that the tenant should state if there's a maintenance issue. It's right that they should report it, because then it prevents further damage going down the line. And what could be a small issue, like you just said, a door maybe not quite on its hinge, could then become a major problem when the door comes off its hinge and it's ripped apart and it's damaged, and therefore it's got to be replaced, which means the cost is so much more. But then the tenant hasn't got a timeline to rely on for the information as to say, when that happened, why it happened, what was the causation. And the fact that they'd let the agent know, and if they haven't done because they said they were trying to be helpful and not be a pain and not be a nuisance, that actually works against them. When I think what agents should be doing is encouraging tenants to use things like self-service inspections to highlight the fact that they've got these issues and get them remedied as quickly as possible, and to prevent that potential issue going forward. And I think also within that, agents got to be aware that tenants will be worried about that. They need to allay their fees, but then tenants also got to be aware they've got a responsibility to make sure that the property is kept well, and that if there are any problems that they let everybody know as quickly as possible, so it then doesn't become an issue. So I think there's a lot of there's the onus on both sides of the fence, as it were, to make sure these things don't happen. And I also think certainly in regards to not just interim inspections, but when it comes to checkout, having the ability to do a pre-checkout visit, if that's possible, or giving again the tenants the ability to do a self-service pre-checkout visit, which we do have on InventoryBase, will help the checkout process going forward, especially if there has been maybe maintenance issues that have been reported and maybe have not been dealt with, either because there's a restriction in regards to self-isolating, or because maybe the landlord just hasn't responded to it, because that does happen. We can't scoot over the waters in that respect. These things do happen. Not every landlord's great, not every tenant tenant is great, not every agent is great, and equally there are agents that are brilliant, tenants are brilliant, landlords are brilliant. So it just depends. But I think as long as you've got the mechanisms, the ability to sort these problems out and give everybody the option to engage, then that's as much as each and any of us can actually do. I think certainly agents need to be talking more with the tenants, because like you said, we don't actually get involved mostly until the end when it comes to the checkout.
Yes, that's it. And I know, I mean, there are some agents that are giving sort of little courtesy calls just to see how everything's going, and sort of welfare checks in that respect. And maybe that will prompt people to report any issues then. In line with what you were saying, you know, it is the tenant's responsibility to report problems before they become a bigger issue. I did a checkout recently, and part of the ceiling plaster had fallen down. It was completely missing. There was just bare patches of ceiling, and the said, well, you know, it's wear and tear, and we were talking about how that might possibly be, and he said, well, it was just stress cracks, and they got worse and they got worse, and at some point it just fell down. It didn't sort of go on anything, but again, he had not told anyone that that was happening, that it was getting worse. And I think part of that is in line with the fact you see it every day, and maybe he wasn't realizing how bad it was, but all of a sudden it was a bigger issue. And then, you know, if it had been addressed sooner, if there had been sort of a pre-tenancy check beforehand, or, you know, an interim visit, then it could have been addressed in a better way. But obviously that kind of thing was quite a big shock for a landlord that then was planning to rent out the property relatively quickly, in not knowing these things. And, you know, unfortunately, I think it's probably not as uncommon as it should be that things are just left until the point when, you know, it is a bigger issue.
Yeah, exactly. And I can understand, like you just said, that, you know, a tenant would probably think, well, you know, that doesn't look too bad, or that's okay, and then they said not really paying much attention to it until it got to that stage. And then of course, then I should imagine worry then sets in that, you know, maybe this will be looked at as a tenant's fault, which, you know, from a fair wear and tear point of view, you can excuse some of it, but equally they said they have that responsibility to look after that property. Just because you're renting it doesn't mean then you don't have to then pay attention, and just because you don't have to maintain it to a certain degree in regards to, you know, the things like boilers and ceiling plasterwork, etc. But that's still incumbent on the tenant to let that landlord know, let that agent know. But again, because we're not having these frequent visits, then that becomes more difficult, because you or I would probably pick that up, or we'd question it. We'd ask, you know, was that there before? Is it getting worse? And then and that might then be enough to get the tenant to actually have that conversation with the agent, or if not, we would certainly have that conversation with the agent. But I think there's a lot we can be doing in regards to offering solutions, regards to the self-service inspections, and certainly a checkout. And one of the other things then going on from that is obviously because of the ban on evictions, and the fact that that's now been, you know, I think it's over to March next year. Am I right in saying that? I think it's March.
I think so.
Yeah, March next year. So therefore, there's a potential storing up of problems going forward, because a lot of those tenants that maybe are going through that eviction process, you know, understandably in some certain aspects would not want inspections, and might also not agree to do interim inspections on a self-service basis. So again, our reports from an inventory point of view have got to be on point. They've got to have all the right information, all the right level of detail, so that when we get to checkout, it's very clear as to what changes have happened, and then of course then who's responsible for that. And again, fair wear and tear will come into it, but then if it becomes a maintenance issue that hasn't been brought forward and informed, and it's got worse and it's created a bigger set of issues and potentially damages that could be costly to the landlord, that checkout is going to be absolutely vital from the detail point of view.
Yes, and I think this is where sort of third-party inventory providers really come into their own. That our advice, I think, at this time, if ever, is now more invaluable than it ever could be. You know, we do have the experience of knowing what where looks like over a period of time, and we can make some of those assessments as to, you know, whether it's really just been left to deteriorate and it's something that the tenant could have addressed, or, you know, whether it is something that is just going to have happened over a period of time, but obviously it's escalated through this. And with you saying before, with meter readings, all of this now, they can seem like such small things, but actually these are going to be such big things for landlords and tenants going forward. The checkout and the inventories are more important than ever.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think certainly from our point of view as providers, it's not something that we don't know, but something we were kind of talking before we started this particular podcast, and it's something we're going to address at another podcast, is the fact that we're not very much included in the conversation in regards to tenants and agents. So we're only kind of like getting part of the conversation as to what's happening, what's going on. And if we're then not seeing the tenant at checkout from a physical point of view, because normally we'd have a conversation, we would meet them at the property, we'd talk about the property, have a conversation about the how the tenancy has gone, whether there's anything that they need us to know, etc. If we don't have that information, we're only going to be able to obviously provide what's in front of us, which is right, but then it'll be in some respects a bit difficult maybe to apportion liability, to any damage, to decide whether it's fair wear and tear, because maybe we don't have that full picture, which is certainly something that, as an industry we need to be looking at and addressing as to how we can be more included in those conversations in the process. Because if you look at the actual lettings process itself, and it's something I've actually mentioned on LinkedIn today, is the fact that it's very much governed by legislation, by guidance, by requirements, by redress schemes, etc., as to how things should be, when they should be actioned, how they should be, and so on and so forth. And yet, for some reason, we as inventory providers and the inventory report and checkout report can't get frog leaped over. And I've never really understood exactly why, because it's such an important document, and like you quite rightly say, even more so now than ever.
Yes, and as we were sort of saying earlier in our little pre-chat that we do, the fact that our documents are so important and we're not included in the process, it seems a bit illogical in that respect. Everything's geared towards what will happen sort of letting the property, and then what happens at the end of the tenancy, and the inventory and the checkout are seen by most agents and the schemes as so important, and to have those independent documents, and yet we're not the ones that are consulted about that throughout the process as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's I think it's something that we all know. I think there are solutions. I think there are some really good solutions out there that we could employ, but I think we need a much more collaborative working approach, throughout the industry as a whole, including deposit schemes, agents, landlords and tenants, because at the end of the day, tenants are in fact the driver. Without a tenant, there's no need for a home. If there's no need for a home, there's no landlord. If there's no landlord, there's no need for an agent. So tenants are very much central to this. So I think, there's certainly things we can do as an industry, as individuals, as providers, to help that process. But I think there's also a need for us to be more inclusive and included in that process. But certainly that's, I think, maybe something for our next podcast. So I think that's kind of highlighted a lot of things that I'd wanted to say. What are you up to now going forward? We're now into a rundown towards Christmas, and I know people are going, oh my God, don't use the C word.
Yeah.
We're in the rundown. We're literally days away from October, so it's not that long. I mean, I'm already planning for my Christmas dinner, etc. And certainly, during this period, we certainly see a little bit of a rundown, in regards to report numbers, etc. Is there anything that you're planning on doing in the run up to that quiet period, or everything is pretty much just business as usual for you?
It is business as usual. Things will start getting a little quieter now, and I think because we've had such a busy season, it's quite welcome to having that break and being able to focus a little bit on more of the mundane administrative tasks. But as we've sort of been talking about inspections, I've seen a massive increase in those now. And I think possibly because of the worry that we might have the next lockdown. So the ones that were postponed before, obviously landlords have been chasing those, and I think agents and people have thought, oh, okay, you know, we'll get to those. But myself in particular, I've now had a sort of a big batch of them because people are worried that, well, if it happens again, you could conceivably, you know, have a property 12 months down the line that's not had anyone visit it, which people are, you know, rightfully a little bit worried about. And I think that now more than ever takes more time than what it would do, because it's sort of managing the whole process. And, you know, I touched on talking to a tenant earlier and just explaining how it would be in the PPE that I was going to wear. And I feel like I probably say the same thing to everyone. You know, I'm repeating myself a lot, but people are worried, and it's important to address that. So that's taking more time than it probably normally would have previously. But yes, I think once those inspections are out the way, then we're fully towards Christmas, really.
Yeah, very much so. I wonder, one thing I do wonder, and obviously what's happening with the student market at the moment, what's happening in Glasgow, Manchester, and other areas, and from a UK mainland point of view, we are a few weeks behind Scotland, is whether, you know, we are going to see a mass exodus of students leaving their properties. And it's something I touched on in a LinkedIn post that I put up yesterday, was if we're going to see that, then what does that mean for the landlords, for the agents, in regards to the properties being, you know, unattended, void, for want of a better phrase, if there's no one physically there, the fact that we're going towards winter, the fact that, you know, inherently, you know, pipes burst, properties get damaged because of the cold weather, and we don't necessarily yet know what that will look like. And then if the properties aren't having tenants, students living there because they've all gone home early, you know, does that mean then that they're going to be adequately insured? And it also, does it mean then that landlords are going to be looking maybe to the residential market to get the properties filled? You know, will we see an uptake in the next tranche of students like we normally do around January time? Or are we going to see that, you know, be a very quiet period, an unusually quiet period, because of what's going on? It's very much up in the air, very open. But I think certainly from an agents and landlord's point of view, they need to be thinking about like this, like now, so that, you know, tenants are going to go home. Will they be asking for, you know, to be released from their tenancies? Will they be asking for a rent reduction? How does all that look? And then obviously from a provider point of view, what do we need to be doing about that? Will we see, in a way, an increase in interim inspections, because they'll effectively become void inspections, because the fact someone at some point needs to make sure that the property is okay, it's not, you know, drowning in flood water, or have, you know, massive holes in the ceiling, or problems you know, with anything of the fabric of the building, because no one's there, no one's keeping it warm, no one's using it, no one's keeping an eye on it.
Yes, I mean, it's a really good point. Like you say, there are sort of the two threads, really. Will the students just leave, as they did kind of March, April time? A lot of them just went home and sort of left it and did classes online from home. And at that point, we saw a rise in checkouts and landlords thinking, you know, I'll try and rent the property. The impact on the market could be quite substantial if they can't rely on students coming in, you know, certain periods throughout the year. If they're always going to worry that they might have to leave the property at some point, whether these are going to be made more residential homes. And like you say, the ones that are just leaving and intending on coming back, whether the agents and landlords will ask us to do more interim visits. I mean, I know I did a checkout at a property where the tenants hadn't been there for some months, but they hadn't carried out the checkout, and there'd actually been a leak, and part of the roof had come through, and the damage was, you know, catastrophic, but no one had known about it. And I think, depending on, like you say, the insurances and the contracts and things, that's something that agents and landlords need to be making their tenants aware of, whether they're going to be held responsible for, you know, not keeping the property secure and in good order.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good example, and that's the kind of, like, exactly the kind of thing I'm thinking about. If those properties are I keep want to say unmanned, but they're not tenanted. There's no one living there, and like you said, something like that happens. Then where does everybody stand from an insurance point of view? Where does everyone stand from a liability point of view? But more importantly, the damage to the property going unchecked for that amount of time. I can see this happening more and more and more. Not necessarily in like student halls, these big purpose-built properties, but certainly in the residential HMO type properties, I can see that happening. And I think certainly it's something for agents to be thinking about, and maybe doing more void checks depending on what happens with the market. But we're not going to know really what that's going to look like, certainly for the next couple of weeks. So I think that's probably going to feature very much indeed in our next podcast. But it's certainly something to get the grey matter working on at this time.
Yes, it's important to consider, isn't it?
Definitely. Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up today's podcast. Thank you, everybody, for listening. It's been a while, but as everyone knows in the industry, these last few months, certainly during the summer period, has been very, very busy, and everyone's been concentrating on their own business. But we're looking forward, Melissa and I, to discussing more what's happening with the industry. I think there's a lot more to be going on with as we head towards Christmas. And I think certainly the student market is definitely going to be a subject of conversation for our next podcast. So look forward to welcome you all then. Thank you again, Melissa. Thank you for your time, because I know you're very, very busy.
No, you're more than welcome. I always enjoy our chats.
Yeah, me too. We look forward to inviting everybody to our next Inventory Professional podcast.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Inventory Professional Podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, subscribe to our podcast now and share the love. This podcast was brought to you by InventoryBase, providers of industry-leading property inspection software, accredited training, and on-demand property reports.